All right, welcome back. Raise your hand if you've ever wondered how to write an invasive species management plan in your whole life. I have. I'm still wondering. Well, we've reached across the country to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And as I mentioned earlier, they have a guide or a couple of guides on how to write invasive species management plans. So I'd like to introduce our next two speakers. Jenny Ketterlin is the invasive species coordinator with the U.S. Forest Service for the Pacific Southwest region, where she's responsible for coordinating regional invasive species management activities on the national wildlife refuges in California, Nevada, and part of Oregon. Prior to this position, Jenny worked on invasive species issues in Florida for over 17 years with the National Park Service, University of Florida, the Miami-Dade County Environmentally Endangered Lands Program, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Jenny's experience is in wildlife and habitat management with a wide variety of species and ecosystems, especially non-native plants and animals. Joining Jenny is Laura Eaton. Laura currently serves as the coordinator for invasive species for national wildlife refuges in the Northeast region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Laura wears many hats and has also coordinated surveys on refuges, including acoustic surveys of bats and wood turtles, and worked with other developing water quality surveys and bumblebee surveys. Laura has worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for more than 30 years and previously worked for the New England Field Office of Ecological Services in Concord, New Hampshire. Laura has a BS in Wildlife Management from the University of New Hampshire and an MS in Fisheries and Wildlife from Michigan State University. So please welcome Jenny and Laura.
Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me okay and see my slide there?
Very well, and we can see your presentation, yes.
All right, great. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. Again, my name is Jenny Ketterlin, and I am an invasive species coordinator with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the Pacific Southwest region refuges. And I'm here today to give you an overview of a guide created to help land managers conduct invasive species management planning that was created by folks with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in conjunction with the California Invasive Plant Council. Laura Eaton, my counterpart over here in the Northeast region, will follow that up with some examples of how her region is implementing components of the guide in the field. And again, just to quickly orientate you as to where I'm located, I'm in what is known as the Pacific Southwest region, or Region 8, which is made up of 50 very diverse national wildlife refuges and wildlife management areas in California, Nevada, and the Klamath Basin in Oregon. And I am based in our regional office in Sacramento, California. So several years back, our region's I&M program, the Inventory and Monitoring Program, provided funding to the California Invasive Plant Council to create this land manager's guide to developing an invasive plant management plan. And the guide can be used to inform development of traditional IPM plans that many of you may already be familiar with, or add aspects of invasive plant management to other planning documents. While this is a guide for writing a plan, the concepts laid out in the guide can also be adopted on their own when developing an invasive species management program, even if you haven't actually written the full plan. Writing the plan is obviously the goal, but doing the activities that should occur prior and after plan development are equally as important. And most of the refuges in our regions, these are the steps on which we currently have made the most progress, those steps that occur prior to writing the actual plan. And Laura will go into more detail on that later when she talks about how her own region has implemented these concepts. The developers of the guide created it in the hopes that it will help land managers to be more strategic and adaptive when approaching invasive species management, to work smarter, not harder, especially when facing limited resources, as most of us do. So what does it mean to be more strategic and adaptive? It's basically applying an adaptive management framework to invasive species management, where you strategically assess and plan the management actions you will implement, and then follow up by monitoring and analyzing results so that you can adapt when something is not working or in the face of new information. So notice this is an iterative cyclical framework, which also allows us to react to changing conditions and take advantages of new technologies. So the Land Manager's Guide goes through this adaptive management framework and goes through the steps of how to do this in a lot of detail and points to many helpful resources along the way. So this model in the guide shows the basic components, and I'll be using it to step us through the activities. While the model does not include the share step in adaptive management, the guide refers to several ways in which it's important to the process. So one of the first points that the guide makes is that terminology matters. So you need to make sure that upfront you're defining your terms. Be aware that the terms you use in your own land management planning don't need to match the terms in the guide. Recently, another one of our regions started using containment and suppression versus containment and asset-based protection. And this nuance in how they describe their objectives helps them better communicate to the field based on the situations most common for their regions. So it's definitely an adaptable guide. And what is really important is to be clear about how you're using those terms and what you mean by them. For example, do you consider eradication achieved after a species has been absent for 5 years? And what is the difference between a detection survey and inventory? So now I'll briefly walk through the different parts of the guide as laid out in the model, starting with these first steps in the top row. So these steps are related to preparing to write the plan. You will want to identify the purpose and scope, identify your team, gather site-specific information, and review compliance. Identifying the purpose of your plan not only helps to justify the work, but also helps you focus your own efforts. A lot of times we see refuges continuing to treat the same species in the same area year after year because that's what's always been done. And sometimes it's good to step back and really ask the why and think about what is important to your land management activities. So you'll also want to be clear about what the scope of your plan is, and I'll talk in a minute about how you can prioritize and develop a plan that's both realistic to keep up with based on the resources you expect to have. And for many of us, it might seem easier to just have 1 or 2 people work on the plan, but you will get more buy-in and create more institutional knowledge when you do it as a team. The more people are involved and the more aware, excuse me, the more people that are involved in creating the plan and the more aware and less likely it will become one of those plans that sits on the shelf or in a shared drive somewhere. You especially want to make sure you designate someone as the point person for making sure that planned and executed work is done in a manner that is consistent with the plan. And of course, you want to make sure that the plan follows all the laws and regulations that apply in your situation. Consider all the possible compliance and permitting needs as soon as possible and start these processes early. Some of them may take longer than expected, which is usually the case for us. With your team in place, you can start to gather all of the relevant site-specific knowledge needed, from personal expertise to those old treatment shapefiles hanging out somewhere on someone's hard drive. Once you have all that information and gather up your species list, you want to identify your priority species and the specific areas on the property that you manage. So why prioritize species in land management areas? Because there's simply not enough time and resources to address all non-native species in all areas. Or maybe there are if the property you manage is small enough and you don't already have heavy infestations of invasives, but typically you need to start somewhere, which is usually with the most damaging species in your cleanest areas. We also prioritize because our work shouldn't be done in a vacuum, right? We want to make sure we create opportunities for buy-in and input from stakeholders and are able to document why we're doing what we're doing. So these are the basic steps you can go through to prioritize your species and areas on which you plan to work. Besides your own management area or regional species lists, there are a number of data aggregators out there now from which you can compile lists of species that can be found both on your lands and just outside. Some examples are EnMaps and iNaturalist. It's also ideal to identify outside criteria or a tool to assist with your prioritization process, because you want to have that layer of objectivity so that your prioritization is defensible. And you also want to make sure you're documenting what you did and how you did it so that future managers can understand the rationale and don't need to reinvent the wheel. And there are tools out there that will help you do this prioritization. In my region, we use this invasive plant inventory and early detection prioritization tool, which was also developed by our I&M staff along with Utah State University. The tool was just recently updated and it is publicly available along with an updated guide on how to use it. And for those of you that might be interested, I can provide more information on where to get that and the guide that goes along with it. So what is this tool used for? It evaluates and documents which plant species are of greatest concern for your area and whether they be on the refuge or your particular land management area, or if there are future threats, so early detection species found nearby. What the guide does not do is decide which populations to manage. There are also tools that assess management at the same time, but in this case, with our particular tool, they shouldn't be decided until after you conduct your survey for the populations that you determine to be a priority. And the tool, much like the Land Manager's Guide, is available for land managers to use on their own. Like I said, it has that accompanying guide that walks you through the process. However, we've found that it's most productive for our regional staff to hold workshops with refuge staff of about 2 to 3 days to go through the process together. And this slide gives an example of a workshop that we did with one of our refuges. The image to the right is the list of species that was ranked by the information that we fed into the tool. And note that that workshop included stakeholders, which for this refuge is the surrounding ag community. I cannot stress enough how important it is to include those stakeholders in as many part of the conversation as you can. They not only have like a lot of very valuable information to provide, but it gets that buy-in and gets the belief in the plan that you want to see. And this is another example where we have the area prioritization results produced from another project conducted by the National Park Service. And it just shows how they prioritize different areas on their property to guide early detection and inventory efforts based on the factors specified in the tool. And this is especially helpful when you can't conduct surveys on all areas with the resources that you have available. You prioritize them in the high, low, moderate. And then next, that leads us to the step of assessing or surveying for your priority species if you don't already have that information. The Land Manager's Guide doesn't specify how you should do your surveys or inventories, but it does point to a number of survey examples and protocols that can help guide you. So why do an inventory? You may think that you already know where all the problem weeds are on your management area, but we usually find this is where one of those information gaps lies. A good survey not only helps you with everyday management, but can also help you detect those EDRR species. And these are some common considerations that go into how you would conduct your survey. And as I mentioned, there are a variety of different options out there for both quick and dirty and very thorough versions of inventories and surveys, depending on the resources that you have available. So once you've prioritized your species and areas and done your survey, found out where everything actually is, you're ready to develop your management objectives. If your invasive plant management strategies were successful, what would that look like? So this is the question that you want to ask when developing your objectives. And you want to make sure that these objectives are well defined, or what we call SMART objectives. So they're specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time-bound. By creating good management objectives, you can then answer these questions when you get to the evaluation phase, and then adapt and make changes based on the data. So these objectives don't have to be very complex. This is an example of a good SMART management objective for one of our refuges. By 2025, reduce coverage of Arundel within Pixley National Wildlife Refuge to 1% total area. So it is specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time-bound. And finally, we get to developing and documenting the actual management. So you want to select the approach based on your objective for each species and area, and using the combination of techniques which are both most effective, but also have the least non-target effects. And this is what is commonly known as integrated pest management strategy. So ideally, you could, in your land management plan, you would consider and describe all the potential techniques to manage all your priority species in all the places you might conduct management. And then to help narrow down or prioritize management strategies to implement, we need to take these factors shown here into consideration where applicable. And there are also tools, as I mentioned, available that will help you make this assessment in a more objective way, just like with the species and area prioritization tool. And again, Laura will touch on one of these in her presentation. And make sure that you identified your best management practices or BMPs to mitigate harm. And there are a number of resources out there for finding boilerplate BMPs for different techniques and different habitat areas. You want to make sure those are documented in your plan. And next, once you have your plan, it's time to implement. So now you have all the components you need for a good plan, and you need to decide how you're going to implement it from year to year. So you'll probably want to develop a work plan that bites off chunks on an annual or seasonal basis and specifies in greater detail how the work gets done. Usually these work plans are standalone or separate from your bigger planning document. And this is also when it's important to publicize and share the plan with the relevant parties. A kickoff meeting and annual check-ins can help keep the communication flowing, keep reminding everybody that the plan exists, and keep them aware of what's in it. And so there are a number of ways to approach how you organize and track your annual work planning. Our refuges have found that putting the information into spreadsheets is a very practical and streamlined approach to annual planning. It also makes it easy to track your actual efforts from year to year and your progress, and recalculate and adapt when necessary. You can also lay out your SMART objectives in a spreadsheet to help you plan and track your efforts. And something else that's been really helpful is putting together a treatment plan based on phenology to help guide activities throughout the year. And this can be especially helpful when you have new or less experienced practitioners. And our region in general has become big fans of developing these different kinds of management tables that are tailored to the needs of the refuge and help them track their annual activities. And last but definitely not least is the monitoring and evaluating part. So we want to develop a good monitoring program so that we can determine if our strategies are actually creating the results we expected and helping us to meet our ultimate objectives, which is natural resources protected or restored. So what happens when things don't go as planned? We need to identify, understand, and embrace failure. And this could have happened because you made some incorrect assumptions along the way. There are implementation issues, the combination of the two, a lot of different factors. But failures help us learn and adapt as long as we detect them and acknowledge them. And one way you can do that is by sharing your failures with your coworkers, and then also with your partners, such as this group, along with our successes, of course. We want to share those as well. And just remember that we need to be flexible. So new leads will come, new threats will come, And the plan and the people implementing it should be flexible enough to adapt. And finally, make sure you build time for the adaptive part of the adaptive management into your own work plan. It's easy for these components to fall by the wayside with lack of resources and time, but then we're just back to where we started, which is doing things because that's what's always been done without being strategic. And I just want to point out some additional resources in the guide. Appendix C is a template for a plan that also helps walk you through the questions you need to answer for each section. And this is a template for chapter 1. In parentheses, you see the references to the chapters in the guide that describes all of these components in detail. And as I mentioned at the beginning, most of our national wildlife refuges are still actually working on the prioritizing and inventory part of this process and haven't actually put the results all together in the plan. Next, Laura is going to talk about how her region has stepped down the other components of the of the guide and their invasive plant management program. And this is just my contact info, and I can make these slides available to you all. Your organizers have the PDF. This has my contact info and also the website where you can find the guide and many of the other resources that the guide refers to. And up next is Laura. Laura, did you want to share your slides?
Good afternoon, everyone. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes.
Thank you.
Looks good, thank you.
All right. So thanks for inviting us here today. I'm Laura Eaton, and I am the coordinator of invasives on refuges in the Northeast region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which includes you guys, of course. And in case you're not familiar with our region, it extends from Maine to Virginia. I like this map. Please forgive the pink and the blue. The little yellow polygons are the locations of our national wildlife refuges. They probably are a little smaller than what Jenny deals with on the West Coast. Ours tend to range from 1,000 acres to about 40,000 acres. So my role in today's discussion is to talk about how we step down the plan to actions in the field. Really, our work predated the plan, which was completed, or the guidebook, which was completed in 2018. But our national team of invasives coordinators had been discussing this model, which is kind of what predated the guide. It was developed by Jenny's region. And we decided to take each one of these steps and develop tools for each one. So that's what we have been doing. So step 1, of course, is prevention and early detection. This is in no way simple, as you all know. We have to get our maintenance folks on board, and it's a lot of extra work for them. So it's been a process. We did develop some prevention guidance, complete with videos that we took from different states on how to clean equipment. We've been purchasing a lot of equipment for folks. We don't have a formal early detection protocol, but a lot of our refuges have their own processes. Most of them are doing it. So the first step is assessing your current conditions. And so we recommend that refuge staff do a reconnaissance of their refuge with an eye to the invasives. And then, of course, check out other information available, such as the local aggregators, local conservation commissions regarding other plants that might be in the area that we may not be aware of yet. But so our first step is going to be to inventory our plants so that we understand the status and distribution. But where do you start that process if you have a 40,000 acre refuge? So we suggest that refuges prioritize the areas and then the plants within those areas. And for our inventory, they're going to want 10 plants or less for each area. Now, they may have a very clear understanding of where they want to start their inventory and ultimately their management. But then again, if they have a highly infested refuge, Long Island complex being an example, it may be kind of overwhelming to think about where would you start. And so we are recommending that refuges use the tool that Jenny described. It was her region that developed it, but we feel pretty free to steal from each other. We are not doing workshops with our refuges, but if they want assistance, we'll sit down and help them work through the prioritization. I do think that this tool is particularly helpful for identifying priority areas, whether they agree with the ultimate decision of the tool. They may or may not, but I think that the steps of the tool help them think through how to do the prioritization. So I'm actually going to show a few slides of what this tool looks like. This is the area prioritization. You can see at the top the type of elements that it addresses, and below is, the little boxes that you fill in for the tool. It's really very ecologically based. I think maybe the biggest challenge is figuring out how you want to define your areas. For the plant prioritization, the tool is leaning on some existing ranking systems from across the country. I think for the Northeast, maybe a weakness of the tool is the only ranking tool available is from Virginia. And Virginia is very different from Maine. So, I think it's important to run the tool, but we want to keep in mind what we know about how the plant behaves in our area. For the species prioritization, you're going to fill out a series of questions about the infestation for each plant within each area. So this tool does take some time to do, but it spits out some nice little reports for you, one for the areas, one for your species, plant species within each area, and then there's a species area link. And I honestly couldn't remember what that was, so you can see above what metrics it's using to develop that report. So in our region, we are not writing IPM plans yet. I think it would be a wonderful thing to do, but in the end, it's not going to be welcomed by the field staff who already have to write a lot of plans. So we're trying to find some alternative ways to document their decisions. So for their prioritization, we've got this handy dandy form that they fill out, and then they upload it to an archiving database that we call ServCat. So with that information, they're going to begin an inventory of their plants in their priority areas. We recommend that they choose like 3 priority areas, or at least the amount of area that they think that they can cover in 3 years, sort of guessing that that's the amount of time where you wouldn't expect a lot of change in your infestations. This inventory protocol is based on a grid system, which in an area of the country where there's a lot of thick, thorny plants, it seems to work better than trying to run transects. So to conduct the inventory, we use iPads and collector, now called field maps on AGOL. It's intended to be a rapid assessment of the percent cover of the priority plants. Again, usually 10 or less for each area. The size of the grids can vary, whatever the refuge wants. They're typically 50 meters by 50 meters in size. We hire interns to collect the data, although it's intended to be a rapid assessment, it still takes some time to do it. In the end, we can create what we call heat maps, where we color up the infested cells based on how infested they are, which creates a really nice visual of the problem. So as managers, I'm sure you can look at a map like this and automatically start to think about what your strategy would be for addressing that plant. You know, you might contain it over here, you might want to eradicate it over there. Where would you send your minions to do the work? So the next step is to identify which one of those plants you're going to begin to manage. Remember, we inventoried our 10 top plants, but that's a lot to manage. So where are you going to begin your management? The IPIP tool is wonderful for taking an ecological look at your infestations, but it doesn't really consider some of the questions that managers ask. So actually our field staff asked for a tool that specifically addressed some of the questions that they need answered from a management perspective. And so these are the elements. This is an Excel-based tool and it's very flexible. You can actually decide for yourself which one of these elements is most important for your decision making and weight that more. And then for each one of those elements, we have scoring definitions and scores, and you can alter those if there's, for some reason, those don't quite meet your needs. And then for each area, you have to run this separately. For each area, you list out the plants that you have. You use a drop down to fill in the scores, and then it prioritizes the plants for you. And then they can also PDF this result and put that on ServCat. Then we ask them to write their SMART management objectives. And this is very similar to what Jenny described. I think this is really important to think through. This defines what is success. I think a lot of the times we see the plant, we go out and we start managing it without really thinking about what we think we can accomplish with that plant. Can we really eradicate it? Or is reducing it enough? And then if we reduce it, how often are we going to need to go back out there to keep it at that reduced level? And what reduced level do we actually need? Does it need to be 30% less, 50% less? Do we want to keep it at 10%? So my example of a SMART objective is to eradicate Japanese knotweed from the riparian zone of a 0.5 mile segment of Trap Brook within 5 years. And eradication is achieved when the species is not present for 3 consecutive years. Doing this in as quantitatively a manner as possible really sets us up nicely for monitoring. And of course, the next step is actually doing the management. And on refuges, we're using all of the methods you guys are, herbicides, mechanical, anything you can think of. But at the regional level, we're trying to dig a little bit deeper, research some of the problem plants and see if we can't think of some new things to try. As you all know, we've got some things out there that are still really difficult to manage. We're also trying to take kind of a restoration view of some of these problems, thinking about assessing what the disturbance was that opened the door to invasion. We're looking at, say, an old agricultural fields. We're finding soils are very compacted, where the roots of the plants are only within the top 6 inches of the soil. If you wanted grasses on that site, their roots are 2 feet deep. The other thing we discovered was the pH of the soils in our part of the country are kind of acid, usually 5.0 to 5.5. Well, where we want to maintain grasslands, those grasses actually need a neutral pH. So for where we want to maintain pollinator habitat or grassland habitat, we're thinking about whether we need to apply lime just like you would to your lawn. Otherwise, maybe we should think about transitioning those sites to forests, because that's really what that land wants to be. We also have some work looking at hydrology of salt marshes and whether alterations have led to Phragmites invasions. Restoring natural hydrologic function, we are hoping that that will address the Phragmites as well as make the salt marshes more adaptable to climate change. And then we're also trying some reduced herbicide techniques, like bringing in goats for grazing and browsing. And then we track our management actions in another database on AGOL that we call MonMan. This is an example of one site. They've got a little drop down that shows you what they did. The polygons with the white line around them, that's those are the invasive actions. And lastly, monitoring, and this is something that I am just finishing up right now. We're developing some guidance for how to do monitoring using the same grid system that we use for inventory. This is, I made up a bunch of scenarios and how you might do your sampling throughout your management to make sure that it's headed in the direction you want it to go, as well as what measurements you would take to see whether you met your management target. This particular figure is an example of a containment example. And so that is a summary of how we're addressing invasives at this time. Happy to answer any questions.
All right, we do have some questions. Can you go up near a microphone? Yeah. There's one here, there, and there. Next time we'll have one on each table. They wouldn't reach. So we do have some questions.
So we're using the Field Maps app, and it's connected to the ArcGIS online. And we would love to use a grid system along with that. I realize it's kind of a technical question that maybe we don't need to walk through right now, but if you have any guidance on that, I'd really love to learn how to do that. Yes.
So we have a protocol that we would be happy to share with you, and I do believe that it steps through how to create a grid.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
So We do have a formal protocol for our grid system. I believe it does walk you through the methods of creating a grid. We would be happy to share that with you.
Oh, yeah, that would be great. I'm not sure what the best method of that would be. Maybe I could email you.
Or you can email LIISMA, or we can email you and forward it to Juliana.
Great.
Sure.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Are there any questions in the chat? If people have questions, please write them in the chat. And we do have some questions in the chat.
I see there's a question regarding which prioritization tool should land managers use. It sounds like you guys have heard of some examples out there as well. And really, there's no wrong answer. And the tool you should use is really the one that works best for you. So one that, either can be implemented with your field staff on the ground, like a tool that they can understand and use, or if you want to do the workshop method like we do, where you have some people help walk them through that. You can use a tool that is a little more complicated, but there are a lot of great tools out there, and it really just depends on what works best for you all. The great thing about the tools is it just helps add this layer of objectivity and helps you question some of your assumptions. And then it also helps you to document why you make the decisions that you did. So even with our prioritization tool, we often have managers say that they don't necessarily agree with the ranking of a specific species. And so we'll even tweak that at the end of the process. But what's important is that you document why you did it, just so, future managers, other folks can come in and see, this is why they were managing for this, and this was the rationale. And it also helps when you get new information and decide that you're going to change it. But like I said, that our tool is available. I can send a link to the organizers of the meeting and provide that and help to answer any questions if people have them.
Are there any other questions in the chat?
Also, I think it depends on whether you are prioritizing for inventory or whether you are prioritizing for management, and also how much you feel like you know about the plants, what kind of tool you want to use. Although we recommend using the IPIP tool, I think our biologists use our prioritization for management more often because it's really quick.
I think that's it with the questions. Thank you very much, Jenny and Laura. Let's everyone clap.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
That was extremely helpful. Thank you very much. And have a nice weekend. It's Friday.
Yep, same to you all.
Thank you.